Hello all, and welcome to the webinar, Levelling the Field, Advantages of a Skill-Based Hiring Labour Market Perspective for both Buyers and Sellers. My name is Daniel, and I'm the VP of Operations at Lightcast here for the APAC region. I'm delighted to be facilitating this webinar today. If you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please let me know in the question box, and we'll endeavour to answer those at the end of the presentation. We'll be sharing the recording of today's presentation in a follow-up email, so please do keep your eyes open for that. We appreciate you all taking the time to be here today and hope that the information provided will provide some thoughts into how adopting a skills-based lens is beneficial for all actors within the market. My first job is to introduce our speakers today. I'm very happy to know that I might be the only one speaking today, which is nice. Firstly, we have Rusha. Rusha is a senior economist and research director here at Lightcast. Recent research topics include an analysis of the impact of adult education, understanding the potential effects of the CHIPS Act on the semiconductor workforce, and investigating skill-based hiring and skill mismatch in the labour market. She is a frequent guest economist on the Finance Cable News networks, and her research and insights have been cited in national media outlets including the Wall Street Journal, the US News and World Report, Washington Post, CNBC, and the New York Times. Rusha manages a team of analysts supporting Lightcast's internal research agenda. Prior to joining us here at Lightcast, Rusha served as a research director at a large education think tank based out of Harvard University, where she oversaw projects in urban school districts focused on reducing the racial achievement gap and managed a team of research analysts. She also has an extensive experience with econometric modelling, and worked on the marketing team at American Express. So thanks, Rusha, for joining us today. We also have Joe Ingold joining us today. Joe is an associate professor of human resource management at Deakin Business School and has spent over 2 decades working in and around employment services, including in the UK government. Joe's research and teaching encompasses employability and skills, employer engagement, recruitment and talent acquisition, and workplace inclusion. She has built the largest evidence base globally on employer engagement and employment services, and works with governments, industry, and practitioners to embed best practices. She is currently leading 3 large grants, including an ARC linkage on employment services and job quality within 4 industry partners. In 2023, she published her first book on the topic of employer engagement and employment services. Jo is a fellow of the Institute of Employability Professionals and co-chairs the UK Employment Related Services Association's Employment Engagement Provider Forum. She is a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, a chartered academic member of the Australian Human Resources Institute, and editor of the academic journal Work, Employment and Society. In November 2023, she will join the ACU Business School as a professor. Thank you, Joe. We also have Nick Kennedy joining us today. Nick has over 20 years experience, including strategic and operational workforce planning, project and program management, change leadership, and global talent management. This is complemented by a strong aptitude for continuous improvement, supported by experience across sectors including government, mining, resource, automotive, consulting, and mineral processing. Having managed strategic workforce planning and organizational design teams for large global organizations and overseen major change and optimization programs, Nick has a deep understanding of the complex challenges faced by many organizations. He holds a Bachelor of Mechanical Engineering and is passionate about connecting strategy, planning, and people. Nick has significant experience designing strategic workforce planning solutions across local, state, and federal government clients, and is an accomplished trainer and workshop facilitator. Nick has designed and facilitated public and in-house training in strategic workforce planning, workforce data and analytics, and capability mapping for clients in the state and federal government sectors across Australia. As you can see, we've got a very talented and diverse panel for us today to be learning more about this topic. Before we do hear from our speakers though, a little bit about Lightcast for those who might be unfamiliar with us. Here at Lightcast, we turn real-time data into actionable insights for building and transforming the workforce. Primarily, we are a big data company where we provide products to help people understand the labour market in real time. We do this in a number of ways. We can help predict future changes in the workforce. We identify hidden talent pools and streamline focus. We create and identify good jobs with upward mobility using our data as a starting point. And we can map reskilling and upskilling pathways to align learning and investments and labour market outcomes. There's about 615 of us around the world. That number keeps increasing. We've got offices everywhere, including Christchurch, New Zealand, so kia ora from New Zealand, as well as in Boston, Idaho, the UK, Italy, and India. Next slide, please, Ben. We do this by aggregating job and online job information into a job postings aggregate database, where we then run a number of processes across our data to clean it up and make actionable insights. So we can take the unstructured data that is the internet, job postings, and then extract meaningful data points such as skills data in demand, such as the trends for different occupations, salaries, experience levels, etc. Next slide, please, Ben. But why skills? Why this focus on skills? Skills have the ability for people to meet their full potential, companies to grow, and for nations to achieve prosperity. In short, changing to a focus on skills is really important for helping unlock that mobility and start really breaking down that information barrier for both buyers and sellers in the market. Without this level of granularity, we're still left with poor outcomes for everyone. Understanding and having a common language of skills mean we can stop this, we can stop having a mismatch between outcomes and outcomes across the players in the market. So that's a little bit about Lightcast and why we've got interest in this. I'll now hand over to Rusha to talk about some skills and trends in skills-based hiring. Thank you, Rusha.
Thanks, Daniel. So I'm here to present some new research that we've been working on in conjunction with the Boston Consulting Group. This is a project that we will be launching hopefully next month, so I'm excited to share some of the preliminary results with you. Next slide, please. So the main purpose of this project was to understand how skills-based hiring has been growing across the globe. In order to do that, we looked at job postings data from 5 countries: Australia, the UK, Canada, Singapore, and the US, which gave us about 18 million job postings. The way we define skills-based hiring for the purpose of this project is we look at all occupations that typically 5 years ago would have required some sort of 4-year degree. We then look at postings now that are for that occupation, so what we sort of consider a college level occupation, but in fact do not request a college degree. And what we find is that overall there's been about a 3 percentage point decrease, or sorry, 3 percentage point increase in skills-based hiring, or a 3 percentage point decrease in the number of postings that are listing a degree as a requirement. Next slide, please. But as you'll see here, the change is not uniform. So we find the biggest decrease in the job ads requiring bachelor's degree to be in the US, which is a little over 3 percentage points, and then followed by Australia and the UK at 1.4 percentage points. And then on the other side, we actually have Canada and Singapore, and they are both increasing degree requirements. Next slide. So we were interested in understanding a little bit more about what exactly was driving this decrease in requirements and where we could see it. And so we did a couple of different breakdowns. This first one here is looking at career area. So these are grouping occupations by the types of jobs that people are doing. And what we find is that the largest decrease is in hospitality, food, and tourism at a little over 10% decrease. We actually found similar trends in other countries as well. In general, it seems as though somewhat post-COVID, roles that really require a lot of in-person time and maybe in some cases are considered less desirable jobs really have increased their skills-based hiring. Mostly we think to make it easier for people to get into these jobs. So to some extent, we think this is a result of labor shortages. If you look within the occupation group, we'll find that the largest degree requirement drops are in food service supervisors and managers, and hotel managers. If we look at the next largest drop, which is a little over 6%, we find that many occupations within clerical and administrative group have also dropped. Those include office manager and office administrative assistant. Next slide, please. Next, we looked at the industry breakdown. So now this is grouping employers by the type of service that they provide. And here again, we found that accommodation and food service is at the top there, a little over 65%, and then retail trade also dropped about 6%. And this again is in line with what we are seeing in other places. In general, I think because of the labor shortages that we've been seeing, people really are having a harder time still getting people into these jobs. And so that's kind of where we see this movement. Next slide, please. Looking more specifically, interestingly, we found that quite a few governments have actually decreased their degree requirements. This is, again, in line with what the US federal government also has done something similar. And then we also found that a lot of universities have lowered some of their degree requirements. These are obviously mostly in administrative positions, but that is not necessarily true across the board. And we see here that New South Wales is leading the decrease with about 10%. Next slide, please. What we also found, and this again speaks to sort of the idea of the labor shortages, is that because larger corporations are often in a better place to compete for talent, they usually have better benefits, they might have higher salaries. We're seeing much less of a change when it comes to these large companies. And it's mostly the smaller employers, aside from sort of the government and universities, that are really driving this change. Next slide, please. If we look specifically at the types of occupations that we see here, we see one of the biggest ones is desk clerk, the food supervisor I mentioned earlier, and then also some interesting positions within education. We see curriculum and instructional designer. We also see some clerk positions. And then on the other side, where we're seeing increase in degree requirements, is sales assistant within vocational education and editors. Next slide, please. This is now showing some of the trends across countries. And what you'll see here for the most part is, as I said, the US tends to have the largest increase, then followed by Australia and the UK. And consistently, Canada and Singapore are frequently still increasing degree requirements. Next slide. So this here is something that we're excited to show you. This is, to be clear, based on US data, mainly due to sample, but it is something we are hoping to replicate in the Australian market as well. And what this slide is really showing is that in general, if you use social profiles data to look at a skills-based hire, so someone who is in a job that typically requires a bachelor's degree but does not have a bachelor's degree, their promotion rates are almost equivalent. They're very close. In some cases, they're even a little bit higher. And so what this is showing is that I think there's sometimes a misconception that a skills-based hire, because they don't have that degree, is not as good of a hire, and we're finding that not to be true. Next slide. And then on the flip side of that, we actually find that in general, skills-based hires tend to stay longer at companies. We did a bunch of interviews with employers, and what we found is that a lot of employers said they felt as though because skills-based hires to some extent knew that they were being given a shot, they tended to be more loyal to the company because of that. And so we really think skills-based hiring is kind of the wave of the future in terms of both making it easier for employers to get people in, and then really, getting more people into jobs as well as allowing them to stay longer and really become more productive in the end. Next slide. And then finally, what we found is that if you look specifically at the skill requirements, when there's a skills-based hire job posting, they tend to list more skills than they do for a non-skills-based hire. So it does seem to be the case that a degree is in some way proxying for some skills, and then the skills-based hires, because they don't have that degree, are now putting even more skills just to be specific about what they want. And the majority of these skills tend to be common skills as opposed to more technical skills. And so, for example, the types of in-demand skills we are seeing include things like communication, innovation, customer service, and really, I think, are emphasizing again the need for human skills, even in today's job market. And that is all I have for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Risha. That was really interesting, especially around the profiles data being people no less likely to be promoted, but tend to have a longer tenure with an organization. So really insightful work there and a great use of our profiles data to be drawing that analysis from. Now we're going to move to Joe. Thanks, Joe, to talk about enhanced talent acquisition. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Daniel, and thank you to you and Lightcast for the invitation to be here this morning. It's a pleasure to be part of this this webinar and also to see the fantastic data that that Rusha just presented. So a reminder to pop your questions in the chat as we go along. Next slide, please, Ben. Great. I'd just like to pay my acknowledgement of country here. I am dialing in from Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation. So on the screen is a beautiful tree, eucalypt tree from the local area. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging on the lands and waterways of these beautiful countries. Next slide, please, Ben. Thank you. So I've got a couple of points I'm going to talk through just about how, based on Rusha's data, what were some suggestions of what you could do to tap into an overlooked talent pool. So first point on the slide, please, Ben. So the first thing is, my research is predominantly on employment and skills programs and workplace inclusion. So to start with, I just wanted to footnote the fact that, of course, there are key differences in immediate recruitment and selection for immediate vacancies and the longer term talent acquisition and workforce planning that organizations need to do to kind of stay ahead of the trends that the data are projecting. So in Australia, for example, we have 1.4 million potential workers. So that is to say, people who are not in the labour market, not in work, but who would like to be in work. And in the UK, a slightly different measure, we have almost 9 million economically inactive individuals in the UK, some of which would like to work if they had the opportunity. So what I want to focus on here is this group, and it could cover a whole range of cohorts with intersecting attributes, so Indigenous, culturally and linguistically diverse, mature age, younger people, different genders, people with disabilities. So people who would like to work, but who face supply side or demand side challenges. So, but we tend to, in employment services, which Daniel talked about as being my main focus. So these employment services, which attract a lot of public money, $7 billion in Australia alone, the largest spending after defence. So we've got a whole load of people who want to work, employment services that are intermediaries that are kind of in the middle of the supply side and the demand side of employers who are seeking people, and there is such a demand for labour currently in Australia and across other countries. And we know that what such cohorts lack tends to be experience and sometimes formal qualifications, but what they don't usually lack are skills and competencies. It's more how those competencies are kind of packaged and measured when it comes to the selection process and talent acquisition within companies. So I would say for your organizations, there's a great opportunity here. Rusha talked about the loyalty of skills-based hires. So you're looking at improving your hiring effectiveness and your retention rates, reducing the cost to your organization, and also with potential for increasing productivity. So just a few points that I'd like to get across to you just to think about. So review your current practices. Do you have vacancies that are unfilled? What is your turnover rate? Not all organizations do actually have a good measure of this. What is your time taken to hire? How effective is your selection decision making? So actually looking at that and evaluating that is really important. Next point, please, Ben. Look critically at your job design. So when I teach human resource management, we talk about it in theory, that it's a rigorous process of job analysis and job design, but actually it doesn't happen as much in practice as it should. And I think we've probably all been guilty of recycling position descriptions and thinking, well, yeah, this job role is probably the one that we need. But I'd really compel you to think critically about what tasks need to be done in your organization, but also in terms of the design of jobs. Do jobs need to be done in the same way they've always been done? So office-based, full-time. I know some jobs, are like hospitality or retail. Some roles may have to be, a kind of based in a particular location, but are there flexibilities around making more jobs part-time? Because otherwise you are losing out on talent that is out there and available. Also take a look at what other organizations in your sector are doing. So a kind of informal benchmarking. What do their job ads look like? What are they offering? How are they recruiting? And who does it look like they're recruiting? And importantly, where? There was some data that were presented recently by Jobs and Skills Australia showing that employers tend to, hiring managers tend to put out the same job vacancies in the same places and hope that they will capture a different talent pool. That's something to think about. Do you need to look in different places? Where can you find the talent you need? Think creatively. Check your assumptions. Are you trying to recruit what we call a unicorn, basically living on hope that there's this ideal worker out there who's available to work the hours and comes job ready with everything that's needed? So just think about how this, and use the data to inform your decision making. Next point, please, Ben. Check your method validity. So we talk about this in HRM teaching, but what it essentially means is, are your the selection methods you're using actually testing and measuring what you hope that they are seeking to measure? So, are we relying on the same kinds of interview sort of methods that we've always relied on? Are there other ways that you could go about this process? And again, it comes back to the skills, competencies and behaviours that you need to hire for the job roles you want to fill and where you want your organisation to be, not just in the short term but the longer term. And you don't want to put candidates through processes that are unnecessary, and you want to offer a good experience because that's part of your employer brand. And always give feedback. So again, in the theory we always see a connection between the recruitment and selection processes, but it doesn't always happen in practice. Next point, please, Ben. The other thing you can do is partner with others. And as I sort of prefigured at the start, there are many organizations out there under this gamut of employment services, of course, recruitment agencies, but there are a whole load of organizations, not-for-profit, private sector, social enterprises who are available and have caseloads of hidden talent and provide services that are free of charge. Please take a look and see what's around your local area, your kind of labour market, local labour market, regional labour market area, because they have caseloads of people who want to get into employment and are really looking for organisations to offer those opportunities. And importantly, they can help with that education piece of how to recruit differently. Next point, please, Ben. The penultimate point is your organisation ready to receive candidates from hidden talent pools? And this is really important, and it's not always as hard as people think it is. It's not, people sometimes hide behind process, but actually it tends to be a mindset. So what can you do to prepare supervisors, co-workers, middle managers, whatever the size of your organization? Think of broader disability inclusion, for example, and not merely physical access. Think of cultural competence for culturally and linguistically diverse and Indigenous cohorts. And again, there are organizations out there with expertise that you can tap into. But when I talk to employers in my research, there is such great work happening out there. And some of my current projects are really about harnessing the data on that and sharing those good practices. So watch this space. Final point, please, Ben. Finally, measure what you do. So whatever you're doing, and it doesn't have to be onerous, but measure your baseline. Where are you currently at? And then measure the changes, the effect of the changes that you make. So you have some kind of a sense of, yeah, this is really working for our organization, or this isn't really working. So I hope that's helpful to you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. Don't forget the questions, and I'll hand back to you, Daniel.
Okay, look, Rusha, Joe, let's vamp for some time and answer some of these questions that have been coming in. Firstly, for both you and Joe and Rusha, how can education and training institutions best align their programs with the needs of skills-based hiring? And how can they facilitate lifelong learning and upskilling for workers?
I can start. So I think really the most important thing here is understanding what the needs of the skills-based organization are. And it really is, like Joe was saying, about partnership to some extent. The universities are going to be in a good position to talk to employers, right? And employers at this point know that they need more people with skills coming in. And so if you can really start that partnership early, where you're looking at the jobs that your graduates are going into, and then trying to understand what the gap is between maybe the curriculum that's being taught now and what you need it to be in order to get those workers really ready. So I think, partnership and really sort of understanding the data, really understanding where you are at the moment and where you need to be are kind of the two most important pillars.
Nick, we're going to hear from you next.
Thank you so much. I wanted to talk today a little bit about agile workforce planning and really how to use agile workforce planning concepts to adapt quickly to changing market demands by, really aligning workforce planning and skill requirements. So first, I might get you to click over to the first slide for me. Then first, I wanted to talk about strategic workforce planning and some concepts really there. And when we talk about strategic workforce planning, we are talking about connecting our workforce strategy with our organisational outputs. But the intent really behind strategic workforce planning is that it represents your true north or your directional beacon. So really the plan that we hatch out today is actually rarely what we implement 3 or 5 years down the track. And really to try and articulate that another way, I end up turning to the words of a great historian who says, "We do not follow maps to bury treasure, and X never ever marks the spot." And when I say great historian, of course, that's tongue in cheek. That was Indiana Jones back in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. But it's true, right? That X never ever marks the spot within strategic workforce planning, and it is all about figuring out how we reforecast and recalibrate to continue to find that true north. And I'm highlighting this so I can build the case towards that agility and what we need to implement to feed that process. Over the next slide, please, Ben. So if we think about strategic workforce planning, the first time you dip a toe in the water, it may look and feel like a more agile process. So it may be a little bit slower, a bit more project-based, take a little bit longer, and might not respond. But that's going to be fine as far as your initial toe in the water is concerned. But we'll find very quickly the actions, the initiatives, the skills we think we need, they very, very quickly become dated and redundant. So it stands then that a mechanism for ongoing refresh, and that needs to happen to ensure that North Star, that directional beacon is constantly being realigned to things like macroeconomic trends and shifts in our labour market. So contemporary workforce planning approaches adopt principles around agile workforce planning, which ensures a constant analysis of the macroeconomic environment and the labour market to keep that North Star refreshed. So look at this process. Once we figure out what that integration into the way that we work looks like, we can actually remove that. And as Ben flicks over the next slide, we can work towards a process that enables a constant refresh. So next slide, Ben, is that okay? So we've got a process once we figure out that cadence of really continuing to reassess our future state, analyse the current state, conduct a gap analysis, and then plan around that. And you can progress that if you like, Ben, for us. So we now have our agile workforce planning approach, but we have overlaid the desire to shift towards a skill-based workforce planning model, and it's driven by global workforce shortages and the corresponding need to really rethink how work gets done, and at scale. There are some challenges with this. So, we've already heard about the challenges with the maintenance of things like skills taxonomies internally. How can we expect to maintain a consistent view of skills when the sheer number of skills for consideration is immense, and notwithstanding that the rate of change and evolution associated with the emerging skills and the declining and more redundant skills. So most skills taxonomies that are developed internally are outdated in a matter of months, if not sooner. So, in order to really realise a skills-based approach to agile workforce planning, we need a way to access real-time skill information and really refresh this process. So, how are we scanning the macroeconomic environment and keeping that fresh? How are we scanning the labour market? Not only our critical roles, but our critical skills. How are we ensuring that we understand where those skills are housed, what roles they're popping up in, what the forecast is around those skills? So once we get to that point, we can continue to assess the gaps and ask the question, have we moved the needle on some of this stuff since last time we looked at it? And so if Ben can move on to the last slide for me. If I think about how we implement this and how we make an agile approach to workforce planning that is informed by skills, first thing we need to do is we need to understand what that refresh cadence looks like. That's going to be different for different organisations. So the cadence with which a tech company refreshes its workforce plan approach, that might be far more frequent than the cadence with which, say, a mining company goes about it. So that is different for different organisations. So you really need to find your own refresh cadence to make sure that the agile approach is relevant for your own organisation and your own industry sector. Scan the environment regularly. I mean, the last few years have taught us that environment, that macroeconomic environment, can change really, really quickly. And there are a lot of great tools out there that can help inform that environmental scan, at pace and keep it fresh in life. It's critical to continue to scan your labour market, not only for roles, as I mentioned before, but for key skills. The skills that we require and that we will require will continue to evolve and refresh. So it's important that we have an ability to do that. But more importantly, how do we automate that? We've all got HRIS systems, and many of them have skills clouds or skills taxonomy. So how do we create that process and that mechanism to keep those taxonomies fresh? Certainly through the use of generative AI, some great labour market scanning and platforms out there. We can absolutely create that process for automation so that we're keeping that taxonomy and that view of skills as fresh and as real time as we possibly can. Thanks, everyone. We got there in the end.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate you struggling through in the background to get back up and running The joys of technology. This is normally where I'd make a comment about the Australian network and broadband, but I don't think that was at fault here today, so that's all right. So thanks again, Nick. Great points you're making there, especially around the skills-based approach needing real-time data. And again, not wanting to wave the flag too hard, but that's certainly something that Lightcast can help with. And bring in that level of macro analysis without needing to scroll through thousands of sites yourself and trying to bring that all in. All right, well, thank you very much to our panel, Rusha, Joe, and Nick. We've got a few more questions coming through, so if everyone wants to jump back in, we'll take a last few questions before we wrap up. So the first question that came through, just as a bit of a follow-up to the question around the skills taxonomy and similarity between organisations. Someone's come through and asked does the competency, the specific skill term described change over time? So if we've got a skills taxonomy that's maybe describing something like, skills in Microsoft Excel, over time that might mean you know what Excel is. It then might mean you can run some VLOOKUPs and pivot tables, and then as that technology evolves, it might be, can you do Visual Basic macros, which I try to avoid like the plague. Does anyone have any thoughts on how we can kind of keep these things relevant and a good reflection of the competency levels, that what we mean by when we say something like Excel in a job posting?
I think that, I think an issue with job postings is that it isn't very clear, and that doesn't help candidates to work out, am I able to apply for this job? I think there is more that hiring managers can do on this score. But I guess my initial thoughts would be getting behind that specific technical skill, especially if it's something from a more generic suite like Microsoft, rather than specific coding skills or coding languages, for example. So what is it that you actually want someone to do? Is it particular kind of type, analytical approach? And I suppose also that a difference between more general skills versus specific technical skills that could be trained, for example, would also be a distinction that I think needs to be made, if that makes sense, by people putting out job postings. That often there's this suite, back to what I was saying earlier, this kind of wish list for this unicorn out there coming with all these skills ready to hit the ground. But actually, is it more like you were saying, that able to learn quickly? You've got an understanding of kind of basic digital skills, that kind of thing, if that makes sense, because I think otherwise that can be really off-putting for candidates who immediately and people from those overlooked talent pools can be more likely to say, well, I haven't got that, so there's just no way I can apply for this job. Rusha and Nick, any thoughts as to whether you agree or disagree?
I couldn't agree more, Joe. What you've probably stumbled on for me is the difference between capability and skill. So you've almost described there what I say with the data and analytics capability, which is, can this individual deliver the outcome that we need, and then thinking about which skills they pull out of the skill toolbox and apply in which environment and which order to deliver that outcome. So once we find that underlying capability, and that is the one that's probably more difficult to shift and change over time. It can be a little bit more ingrained. It can shift, but we can train in the skill. We can teach someone to use Microsoft Excel, and we can grow them from some basic sorting and filtering all the way through to writing VBA code and developing a macro. But if they've got that underlying data analytics capability, they will probably acquire those skills much more readily and much more quickly.
Nice. Excellent. Thanks for the thoughts there. Look, we peppered the other people, our other panelists, with questions earlier, Nick, as we're trying to sort out some of your IT concerns. So one of the questions that came in, I think we'll direct it to you for some initial thoughts, is what are some pragmatic steps to start to implement a skill-based hiring for organisations new to the practice, and how can organisations, start on that journey?
Yeah, and I saw a slide before, Dan. I think it really resonated with me. It starts with a shift in the thinking. So at the moment, well, historically, many organisations are stuck around the individual and the role. But we need to start to open our minds, our practices, our biases up to the thinking that, capability exists in many different forms as a skill, and work can be done in many different ways. So if we think first about what we need, and that will drive in what form it arrives and how it's sourced, that for me is the most critical starting point, to start to shift our thinking around, skill-based versus person-based. I think that's probably my first point. And then my second one is the recommendation, and I heard this from a big management consulting firm in a podcast during the week, and it's not necessarily an either-or thing. It's how we find that blend between skills and roles ultimately, and understanding that skills can exist across many different roles within our organisation, and they don't have necessarily singular or binary homes, if that makes sense.
Nice.
Any other thoughts from Lucia or Joe?
No, I completely agree with all of that. I think really, it really is about the mindset, first and foremost, but on the employer side and also on the employee side, right? And really, like, as we were talking about, thinking about yourself and all the things that you bring. And I think it's also, there's something to be said about, really investigating sort of the job roles that you have thus far, right? And when you have a job role, is that just a title you've been using because it's convention? Or is there, are there different skills? Maybe what you think of as an analyst is very different from someone else, right? And so I think really kind of drilling down and figuring out, what does that job mean for you specifically, and what actual skills do you need the people to have to be able to complete it?
Nice. All right. Look, I would. There's more questions coming in, but I'm very aware of time. We've come to the top of the hour, so maybe just a quick whip around on what is the one thing that an attendee listening to this recording should be talking about over the weekend, about what they, maybe it's the mind shift change of moving away from, the title, rather than saying I need an accountant, to saying, hey, I need someone with skills in accounts. Would be my one. Maybe we'll start with, again, you, Nick, to balance things through.
Yeah, I mean, for me, again, it's not getting too bogged down in traditional biases, not looking at so much backgrounds, histories, qualifications, thinking about what do we need to source, and what do we need to get in our organisation to deliver the work, and what are those skills, what are those capabilities, and then thinking about, well, okay, what are our options now in terms of sourcing those skills and capabilities? Do we buy them in? Do we build them? Do we borrow them? Do we bridge? We looked at before that, bridging barriers to entry for those who couldn't otherwise engage in the workforce or wouldn't otherwise engage in the workforce. So it's the order in which those two things happen for me that's the most critical, is what do we need to do to gain in order to deliver the work, and then how are we going to do that, rather than I need a person to do the work and that's that.
Nice. Joe, coming to you next.
Yeah, I think my last final thought for this session would be what would happen if you just carried on doing what you're doing? I think that is often the block for people, as Nick was saying it, and I would say it's a mindset issue, and we do see this, that businesses are desperate to hire people, but something is stopping them from doing things differently. So I would really compel anyone here who that applies to, or if they know anyone, just to say, what is stopping you? it could be lack of information, fear. But I suppose it's, what would be the worst thing that could happen if we do things differently? Because currently we're just ending up with the same results, and that's not helping us. But so I suppose that would be my key takeaway. And how can we compel people to think, am I getting the best talent out there? And also, just to say, Daniel, if there are further questions, I'm certainly really happy to answer them via email, and you could post them or whatever. It's just so people don't feel they've asked a question and haven't got an answer.
Nice. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, look, certainly very scary to keep answering the same thing. We do it because this is the way we've always done it, right? It's never a good strategy in business to maintain that.
Exactly.
That
yeah.
Thanks, Rusha. For a final point, and then we'll conclude the session.
I think my final point would be that, there has been this maybe misconception for a while that, you're sacrificing something by moving to skills-based hiring. And I just want to say that, we found in the data that that's just not true, right? Those employees are just as good, and they're going to stay longer, and they're going to be more loyal. So, it really is sort of time to get on board.
Nice. I think it's very, very pertinent to, a story without data is just a story, right? And so nice to have the data to back up to say, like this, it's not the scary new world. It is kind of a lot of advantages with this kind of paradigm shift, to use that expression. Excellent. Look, thank you very much for joining us today, guys. Thank you to our panelists, Rusha, Joe, and Nick. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. A recording of this session will be made available afterwards, so keep your eye out on your email for that. In the meantime, have a great Friday. Hope you've got good plans for the weekend, and hope to talk to you all again soon. Thanks.